Today we're going to talk about Darwin and natural selection. So first, what is evolution? Generally, evolution is a change in a population over time. A little more specifically, we can measure this change by looking at the genetic frequencies in a population over time. A genetic frequency is how often a particular version of a gene appears in a population. So that gets a little ahead of us because we haven't talked about genetics yet, but I wanted you to know that evolution is a measurable thing because evolution is science. It has to be measurable. So let's instead make sure you know the definition of population instead of getting ahead of myself. A population is a group of organisms of the same species living in the same location. So for example, we could talk about the population of humans in Lynchburg. Or we could talk about the population of squirrels living on University of Lynchburg campus. So these are groups of organisms of the same species living in the same location. So evolution has actually been talked about for a long time. People have noticed that populations don't stay the same all the time, that there are changes in populations over time. So Darwin wasn't the only person to talk about this. He wasn't even the first person to talk about this. Even Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, gave talks and wrote letters discussing ideas about evolution. It's just that Darwin was the first to propose the mechanism of natural selection that turned out to hold up to scientific scrutiny. So he was the first one who got some ideas about how evolution works correct, or as correct as anything can get in science, remember. So other people who discussed evolution did not have a mechanism, a way that evolution proceeded that has held up to scientific experiments. So let's back up and let's talk about what I mean by this mechanism of natural selection. And to do this, we're going to talk about another guy named Lamarck. Now, Lamarck was giving speeches in 1809. So he was a little earlier than Darwin, as you'll see, but he was giving lectures and classes about species changing through time. And according to Lamarck, organisms acquire characteristics and pass those traits on to their offspring. So, using this example of giraffes got long necks because they stretched their necks and used their necks. And by that use, their necks got longer and longer. And then they passed those traits on to their offspring. Now, you can make changes to your body. How many of you all have gotten braces or pierced your ears or things like that? You can acquire characteristics. But there are some problems with Lamarck's ideas. Biggest problem, he didn't have any data to support his ideas. And he never actually did any experiments to show that this could happen, because if he had tried to do experiments, he would not have been able to show that it was possible. He actually didn't have a wide following. While he was giving classes and lectures in 1809, he did not have a huge number of people who thought that his explanations had merit. In fact, more people learn about Lamarck these days than did in 1809. And it's because Lamarck is a good foil or a good opposition to Darwin to show some of the problems with certain people's ideas about evolution. And another huge problem, modern genetics disproved it later. Just because you acquire characteristics doesn't mean your kids are going to inherit those. Now, to give Lamarck some benefit of the doubt, this was before genetics was understood. This was before Mendel. Maybe you remember Mendel with pea plants and Punnett squares. We'll get to him later. But Mendel lived after Lamarck, and even when Mendel was alive, people did not learn about his ideas about genetics in a widespread way. So genetics ideas were really about 100 years later, well after Lamarck was around. So genetics, though, says that acquired traits don't pass on to kids. So if you had braces or have pierced your ears, does not mean that your kids are going to have straight teeth and pierced ears, right? Other thoughts of Lamarck. He argued that living things evolved in a continuously upward direction. He said that things evolved towards perfection. So species didn't die out. They evolved into other, more complex species. Now you might be wondering, well, why do we still have simple species? Because Lamarck said that new life was constantly, spontaneously generating to start over again on the path towards perfection. So the reason there are primitive and advanced organisms existing at the same time is because the advanced organisms spontaneously generated longer ago and have been evolving towards perfection for longer. Primitive organisms only spontaneously generated a short time ago. So they haven't had very much time to evolve. Now, this totally not true. Spontaneous generation has been disproved. So spontaneous generation was the idea that you have some broth and it spoils because like organisms just appear in there, or you leave meat out and poof, maggots appear. So spontaneous generation has later been disproved. The spoiling microorganisms that get into broth, they came from the air. Things like mold spores and bacteria floating around in the air. Or maggots are fly larvae. They come from eggs that flies laid, and that's where those come from. They did not poof appear from nothing. Also, evolution doesn't work towards perfection. Those primitive organisms and more advanced organisms that we see, all of them have been evolving the same length of time. So worms and chimpanzees have both been evolving for the same amount of time since life began on this planet, which, a little aside here, these ideas of evolution do not describe how life began in the first place. Okay, so what we learn in natural selection does not talk about where organisms originally came from. Where did life come from? So evolution doesn't work towards perfection. All right, so let's talk Darwin. Darwin was a little later than Lamarck. He was in the mid-1800s. He did agree with Lamarck that change happens over time, that there are populations, they change, we see these changes in these populations. But he disagreed with the mechanism. So Lamarck was all about organisms acquiring traits. Darwin had a different mechanism. Darwin's idea had 4 pieces to it. First part, there's variation in a population. Second, some of this variation is heritable. Again, this was before Mendel was well known with his genetics ideas. So Darwin used the word heritable. We can now use the word genetic because these two ideas go together. But Darwin knew that somehow traits get passed from parents to kids. Third part of his idea, there are more offspring born than can survive. Fourth idea, reproduction isn't random. Certain variations or traits provide better reproduction than others. Now notice, it's the reproduction that matters. A lot of times people talk about Darwin and survival of the fittest. But it's not just survival that matters, it's reproduction. Usually this means that your survival is better too, because the longer you survive, the more you reproduce. But there are some examples where that wouldn't be the case. Like a male praying mantis um, uh, ends up dying as part of reproducing. So a longer survivor actually means he doesn't have kids. So usually survival is better, but not necessarily. So the basic idea of natural selection. If some individuals reproduce more than others, then the traits of the greater reproducers will become more frequent. And if certain organisms with these certain traits reproduce more, then the population will end up changing as these traits become more and more common in this population. This is the idea of natural selection. Now, this is also a testable idea because it's science. So let's investigate. Let's see if the evidence supports the idea of natural selection. So one investigation of natural selection was done with Galapagos finches by Peter and Rosemary Grant. They've studied these finches on the Galapagos continuously since 1973. So they or their grad students have been out on the Galapagos Islands every year collecting and measuring finches since 1973. Why the Galapagos? Why these finches? So the Galapagos themselves are an isolated area, and they picked an isolated area in the Galapagos. So this island that they have visited in the Galapagos does not have any human settlement on it. It's really kind of hard to get to. You have to take a boat and basically jump from the boat onto these rocks, and someone has to then drive the boat away. There's no harbor, so it's isolated. They have just small populations of these birds. They don't migrate, generally not even between the islands. So they're able to get a really good understanding of who is in this population and what are their characteristics. There are 14 different species across the islands. They focused on one particular island called Daphne Major. And Daphne Major is this small island. It's only about 100 acres in total. So that means that the Grants can actually walk the entire island, but it's also big enough to support a population of finches. And they mostly focus on just one species of finch called Geospiza fortis, which is the medium ground finch. So the Galapagos Islands are these islands off the coast of South America. If you look at the little inset piece, you can see here's the coast of South America and here's the Galapagos out in the Pacific. If we zoom in on the Galapagos, Daphne Major is highlighted here, and it is under that dot. So there is that dot of Daphne Major, and the island is small enough that it is even hidden by that dot. It's not Santa Cruz or this island off of Santa Cruz, which is part of Santa Cruz. Daphne Major is under that dot because that's how small it is. So we're going to test these 4 ideas that Darwin had. So the first test, do the individuals vary? Now on Daphne Major, the population of Geospiza fortis averages about 1,200 individuals. And the Grants and their research students have captured, marked, and measured almost every individual finch on the island. And this is one of the mini graphs that they have made. So on this particular set of data, they caught 751 birds. That's what this N means. And this data is based on their beak depth. So how deep is their beak? because when they measure these birds, they measure all sorts of things about them: their wing length, their leg length, their beak depth, length, so many things about them. So they've got mountains of data. And they mark them by putting a band around their ankles. So they can, when they recapture these birds, they know that they've caught them before, and they can see how have they changed, has their weight changed, anything like that. So they can track these birds over the years because they've been there since 1973. But let's look at this particular set of data. We're just looking at one snapshot of data here. And we can see just from their beak depth that we had some birds under 6 millimeters all the way up to at least one bird that had almost 14 millimeters of beak depth. So, do individuals vary? Yes. Yes, the individuals do vary. We've got lots of different beak depths. We've got these counts of finches here. The average is actually shown by this little black triangle here. So the average beak depth from this set of data at this particular time was just under 9.5 millimeters for how deep their beak was. But we can definitely see variation. All right, second question. Is the variation heritable? This one's a little trickier to measure because your traits are usually a combination of genetics and environmental influences. Think about height in people. Genetically, you have a potential for a certain height, but you also have to have good nutrition to get to that height. So it's your genetics and environmental influences. So we need to try to control for that. So the best way to do this is to compare offspring with parents and do this for a couple different years, so that if there's been a bad year or a particularly good year, that the nutrition doesn't change things. So that's what they did with these birds. And let me just tell you that there was different nutrition. So we've got 1976 dates, we've got 1978 dates. And the seeds available were very different in 76 than 78. I'm getting a little ahead of myself on the story here, but know that the nutrition was very different in these years. And they were able to figure out the mid-parent beak depth. So they took the two parents' beak depths and they averaged them together, just so it was a single point. And they looked at the offspring, because remember the grants, they've got lots of data, and included in their data is which parents gave birth to which offspring. And they're able to track those offspring then until they have their offspring, and so on and so on and so on, since 1973. It really is a mountain of data, and especially appreciate this was before computers in a lot of cases. So they literally have lab notebooks stored for years worth of data. So we've got these mid-parent beak depths. We've got offspring beak depths. What do you notice? So hopefully you see that the bigger parent beak depths, so like here, these were parents with really deep beaks, had kids with really deep beaks. This set of parents had shallow beaks, their kids had shallow beaks. Mid-range parents had mid-range kid beak depths. There are a few outliers, but generally, the trend is that it matches. So this is heritable, and that's what these lines are showing. These are the lines of best fit, these trend lines, and there's one for 1976 and one for 1978, but they're showing that generally that follows that trend. Shorter or shallower beak parents have shallower beaked kids, and deeper beaked parents have deeper beaked kids. So heritable. Third question, are more offspring born than will survive and reproduce. Using a different finch that's also on the Galapagos Island, this is Geospiza conorostris, and 89% of these individuals die without breeding. Remember I said that something happens between 76 and 78? What happens is in 1977, there is a severe drought, and it caused a crash in the Geospiza fortis population. So in 1976, it looks like there were maybe even about 1,400 birds at one point. By the end of 1977, there are under 200 birds. So there was this severe drought that wiped out even adults in the population, and no offspring born in 76 survived. And no offspring were born in 77. And we just had huge numbers of birds die as a result of this drought. Now let's think about it another way to continue answering these questions. What if they did? What if all the offspring born did survive and reproduce? So these are some calculations done at various times. Darwin even did some of them. That what would happen if all the offspring survived and reproduced themselves? So let's look at just a couple of these. A housefly. Oops. A housefly. If we just start off with one pair of houseflies and all of their babies survive and reproduce, in 5 months, we will end up with 191 with 18 zeros behind it. That many houseflies. Okay? Or let's look at bacteria. If we start off with just one bacteria, because it divides as it reproduces. We'll just start off with one. In 48 hours, if every one of those offspring bacteria survived and reproduced, we would have so many Staphylococcus aureus that the earth would be covered 7 feet deep. And that's just in 48 hours. And that's a bacteria that just naturally lives on your skin. Okay? So we can think about it in an even different way. In a sexual species, if each male and female couple produces 2 surviving, reproducing offspring over their entire lifetime, then the population is stable, not growing or shrinking. So let's use a bird that you all are more familiar with, robins, okay? You see robins around here. Let's say they make a nest. One pair of robins makes a nest, gets an average of 4 eggs a year. That's a relatively normal amount of eggs a year, and they have nests for 7 years. That's about an average lifespan for a robin, 7 years. That means that they have laid, as a couple, 28 eggs. Now, we do not have robin populations that are growing or shrinking. It's stable. That means on average, only 2 out of those 28 eggs are going to survive, grow up, and have their own babies. The other 26 will either die or not reproduce. So, are more offspring born than will survive and reproduce? Yes, individuals either don't survive or they don't reproduce. So our third test, check. Fourth test, is the reproduction not random? Do certain traits provide a better chance at reproduction than others? Let's go back to our example of our Geospiza fortis birds. This first graph here was our original graph. That was the data set that they took in 1976 of the birds that were on Daphne Major. Remember, with I had shown you all that was our little triangle there, just under 9.5 for our beak depth. Then there was the drought. In the drought, we had all those birds die. There was very little food available. There's really only two kinds of food for finches on Daphne Major. There's morning glory seeds that are soft and easy to bite, and there are cactus seeds that are hard and tough and have a hard case around them that they have to rip open. So, and there just wasn't as much food anymore, because even the cactus plants did not grow well in the drought. It was that severe of a drought. So you can see that our sample went from 751 birds to 90 birds because the birds died. But looking at our survivors, did a certain trait provide a better chance than others? We went from, or the birds went from 9.5 millimeter beak depth to over 10. Deeper beaks led those birds to survive. And it was the survivors that then get to reproduce. Why did a deeper beak lead them to survive? Because they were able to crack open those hard seeds easier. The Grants actually did another study, a separate study, testing model beaks to see, does a millimeter of beak depth actually make a difference in how easy it is to crack a seed? And the answer is yes. So the deeper beaked birds survived better. It's only the survivors that get to reproduce and have babies. And if the survivors have a deeper beak, what kind of beak will the babies have? So this is natural selection. The birds with the deeper beaks survived better. They were able to reproduce. They passed that trait on to their offspring. So the population ended up with deeper beaked birds. Now, there are many other documented examples of natural selection that tell this same story over and over and over again, that there is variation in a population, and this variation is heritable, and more offspring are born than can survive, and there are traits that are going to allow certain individuals to reproduce more than others. And so that trait then gets passed on more into the population. So let's recap the difference between Lamarck and Darwin. So Lamarck, these individual giraffes changed and passed their traits on to their offspring. As they were using parts, they acquired new characteristics, and those characteristics got passed on. Lamarck also said that species don't die out, they just change because they need to. Lamarck, not supported by evidence. Let's look at what Darwin says in comparison. Individuals with fitter traits survive and reproduce. So here we've got 3 giraffes. There's variation in our population. Some have short necks, some have long necks. Check out the next picture. We still see our long-necked giraffes. Where's the short one? Look down at the ground. That's supposed to be a little dead giraffe. Sorry. So those others that aren't fit die. This means the population changes. So if we figured up the average neck length of our first picture of giraffes and compared it to the average neck length of our second picture of giraffes, the average of the second picture, they have longer necks because the short-necked one died. It takes it out of the average. But the population changed, not the individuals. Okay? The individual either lives or dies. Okay? Population changes, not the individual. And species often go extinct, according to Darwin. And that really is the case. In fact, most species throughout the history of life have gone extinct because they've not been able to survive and reproduce in light of certain changes. So, natural selection is not equivalent to evolution. This is only one way that evolution can take place. We're going to talk about some other ones. Other ways are going to include sexual selection that involves mate contests, things like peacock tails. There are also random events. Things happen just randomly that isolate sections of the population, and then that population can end up changing in other ways. Sometimes deaths happen in a population that are just by chance, like a landslide wiping out a section of wildflowers. It wasn't because they had a trait that let them survive, it was just random where the landslide happened. Or someone stepping on some bugs. There was nothing that these bugs over here did that stopped them from being stepped on. It was just chance who got stepped on, but now the population is different because green bugs just by chance got stepped on. So now there's many fewer green ones in this population. So we're going to talk about these another time, but know that these are other ways that evolution can happen, that natural selection is one mechanism of evolution that we are learning about.